All right, guys, welcome back. If you're here, it is because we have made it through the Great Depression and are moving into America gradually getting involved into World War II. So I'm going to have two of these for you. One is on foreign issues. The second one is on domestic issues. So today we're simply going to look at what was happening with America dealing with foreign countries that led us to getting involved into World War II, what we did during that war, and looking at the potential aftermath of that war. So let's get it going. Just checking this map out here, 1939. When you look at the actions of Germany, Hitler began taking little pieces of land in Germany, the Sudetenland, the Danzig corridor, and then, of course, World War II erupts in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. And as you can see by this map, the extent of the Germany and their allies, and any of those shaded areas there were areas that were conquered by Germany during World War II. So let's get it going. World War II, pretty much, you should know that it officially began. This is the date that historians look at, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. The United States would not enter that war for another 2 years. So when we look at that post-World War I isolationism, it really holds true for a very long time, and we don't get involved until 1941. So the date that really brings us in is when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. So the war will end in Europe in 1945. The war will end in the Pacific with the Japanese in 1945. So when you look at kind of the extent of the war, how long it lasted, it certainly wasn't short. And we'll see what happens at the end as well. So what you see here is Germany invading Poland, the Russians kind of coming in on the eastern front and kind of saying, hey, enough is enough. And right in here, there's going to be a tremendous amount of fighting, and the Soviet Union will lose more people than any other country in both World War I and World War II. So once again, this is a devastating event, and America was kind of keeping our eyes closed to what was happening because we were still dealing with our own problems in the Depression. So what brings us into the war, you should know, is the attack on Pearl Harbor. And once the war actually happened, we gear up, we get our factories rolling, we train our troops. And by 1944 is the day we're officially committing troops and getting in there. So it's known as D-Day, right? Very important day. June 6th, 1944. Around that time period, you'll certainly see some memorial stuff happening around our country on June 6th, kind of a big day. So it was a combined invasion. We didn't do it on our own, and I'll show you a map in a minute. We invaded the beaches of Normandy, France, coming across the English Channel. It is, in the world, in world history, the largest land, sea, air invasion of all time. Over 150,000 soldiers. All right, we codified it in our own military books as Operation Overlord. All right, so when you look at the map here, there were other countries involved. Obviously, the British were the other heavy hitters there, but we invaded these beaches of Normandy kind of to sweep through France and to push the Germans back. So you have these 3-4 little red arrows here. These are the British going in on Gold, Juno, and Sword. And if you hear any kind of American stories, we hopped in at Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, and the death tolls were severe. D-Day was a very, very devastating day. One of the top 10 deadliest days in American history. All right. If you've seen any kind of pictures or movies or something, you might see a scene like this. This is the soldiers coming in off these little PT boats, hopping off into the water and then getting on the beach. And the Germans held the high ground. They had the little pillboxes, and then they were firing, and it's going to be pretty tough for them. So that was our strategy in Europe, D-Day, and kind of sweeping through Europe and kind of getting the Germans to get on their heels and backtrack. Now, what's happening in the Pacific is something known as island hopping. And there was a strategy in the Pacific of, we don't have to conquer the Japanese in every location that they're at. We need to really just conquer strategic islands that held air bases or airfields, places to land our planes. So General Douglas MacArthur comes up with this idea, and he kind of leads it, right? American forces began capturing some Japanese-held islands, not all of them, just some of them, and ignoring others in a steady path, moving closer and closer and closer to Japan. So when you analyze this map or you see something like this purple line is the extent of the Japanese Empire. And if you notice, their empire was getting pretty large by 1941. And of course, what did they do? They bombed Pearl Harbor, which is right over here in Hawaii. Notice how close it is to the Japanese Empire. All right, so once again, our policy is we're going to hop hop, 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 until we can get close enough to bomb mainland Japan, known as island hopping. So if you want to read any crazy stories about things happening in the Pacific, Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle of all time in world history. More boats were involved in Leyte Gulf than any other battle, and oddly enough, no ship even saw another ship. It was fought primarily with aircraft. So you got that hopping. What you do need to know about this island hopping campaign is, as we went through the Gilberts and the Marshalls and Guam and Saipan and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, as we continue to get closer to the Japanese, what our military was finding was that the Japanese were fighting a little harder on Guam than they did over in the Gilbert Islands. They were fighting a little harder in Iwo Jima than the other islands. And the American death tolls were going up. So we were losing more and more and more of our men. And by the time we get to this decision of should we invade mainland Japan, Harry Truman decides to use something else. So we're going to get into that now. There's a project, secret project started by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt does not drop the atomic bomb nor order it. He dies of polio. Harry Truman, the new president, will have to make that decision. So this project was primarily run by Dr. Robert Oppenheimer in New Mexico. There were multiple locations where different testing was being done. And what happened with this secret Manhattan Project is we created the atom bomb, sometimes known as the A-bomb, right? The atomic bomb. And in Los Alamos, Mexico is down there. That's where primarily the work was being done. But there was a lot of different other places doing research, looking at, splitting these atoms and creating this thing. And, obviously it was a very secret project. So you may see something like this, what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. So don't let people know exactly what you're getting in on. All right. So, what happens? We get close enough to Japan, and Truman decides instead of invading, because the American loss of lives would be so high, he decides to use this particular weapon. And what President Truman, he made that decision to drop those bombs because Japan would not surrender. And we knew that by how fierce they were fighting the closer we got. So. What the atom bombs do, they're devastating. Killed over 100,000 Japanese instantly. All right. Many died later of radiation and cancer, sickness. So, the numbers really will never be truly known, but this is a devastating weapon, right? Japan, after the second bomb is dropped, surrenders a few days after. And once again, these are the only two times that the atomic weapon has been used on civilians, so it's pretty devastating. World War II was officially and finally over, unconditional surrender. So, the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is absolutely devastating to the civilian population that was there and to those two towns or cities that were there. But that was Truman's decision. He did it, and I hate to see the carnage if Americans had to invade Japan, so it did not happen. We're going to talk about wartime diplomacy. There's going to be a series of meetings, 4, 5, 6 of them that kind of happen, 2 of which are bigger than the others. But when you just take a peek at the tracing of the events here and kind of peek at the years as you go through, you'll see it. Remember, we joined in the war in 1941. It will officially end in 1945. So what happens in 41? Roosevelt and Churchill, they meet on battleships in the Atlantic to agree on establishing free governments in the world, or countries can establish their own decisions rather than having maybe some other stronger country tell them what to do, maybe an end to imperialism. And we wanted a lasting peace because we've been through World War I, now we're in the middle of World War II, and we want to make sure we don't have another one. So who you have here is obviously you got Winston Churchill, the leader of London, leader of England, and then obviously Franklin D. Roosevelt, leader of America, right? And there's Harry Truman behind there. They met again 2 years later in Morocco, and Roosevelt met with Churchill again to plan a victory on all fronts and an unconditional surrender. We wanted to make sure that we were able to defeat the Germans and the Japanese and then create this long-lasting peace. So they meet again just to kind of mull things over. And now we're 2 years into the war, and things aren't as jovial now as they were before because of the carnage and destruction. There's Churchill, and of course he's smoking a stogie. You always see him with the cigar, right? They meet again in Cairo, 1943. And Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek of China discussed D-Day and how we were going to go about pushing the Germans back. So when you look at the leaders there, Chiang Kai-shek, who would be our ally during the Cold War, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and then Winston Churchill. Once again, there's a cigar. He's got a cigar. 1943, they meet in Tehran. Roosevelt and Churchill meet with Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. And we really discuss our war strategy, how we were going to win the war, and our plans for a post-war world. So when you look at the heads of state over in Tehran, there's Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the leader of America, president, and then Winston Churchill. And there's the stogie. He's always got his little cigar, right? Wartime diplomacy, Yalta. Yalta's the big one. War is almost over. We kind of know it's going to be over. We pretty much know we're going to win. So Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin get together and outline the division of Germany after the war is over. The other decision that was made at Yalta was the Soviet Union made a promise to us that they would help us defeat the Japanese come late in the war when we were fighting in the Pacific. And they kind of went back on that promise. And I don't want to blame them here. It's not their fault. I mean, they've suffered so much in terms of loss of life and servicemen that they just decided not to do what they said they were going to do. And really, our relationship with the Soviet Union begins to go downhill after, they don't join in to help us with the Japanese, right? So, once again, you got Churchill with his cigar, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. Once again, still pretty chummy because Stalin said that he would help America when it came time to defeating the Japanese. Well, when we make it to Potsdam, the Allied leaders, Roosevelt is no longer there because he dies of polio. Truman will replace him, and they warn Japan that, hey, if you do not surrender, there will be utter destruction. And they're still pretty chummy a little bit. There's the new guy, Truman. FDR, you will no longer see. So if you need the vocabulary for the worksheet, you got that. There's two other issues that happened during this war. One during the war and then one after. Most of you should have, by 11th grade U.S. history, should have a good idea of, what took place during the war with Germany and their final solution. Hitler and the Nazis begin to build concentration camps, extermination camps. Some were work camps, some were death camps. I mean, there's a whole, you can get in, I don't want to get into that. It's bad. About 10 million people were killed, executed from disease, starvation, gas chambers. And really what the Nazis referred to this was their final solution. As the Americans began liberating parts of Germany, we found places like this, these extermination camps, malnutrition, people, and it is very bad. So you should know that those things were happening. I can't believe there's still people out there who say that, the Holocaust never happened. It's wrong. And as we begin to liberate these areas, these are the things that the American servicemen found. And of course, you could see the shock at coming across a fenced-in area with those people in there. So during war, if you commit crimes, if you do something inhuman, if you violate things like the Geneva Accords, which will be built later on, what happens is we finally, as a society, as a globe, decided that if you do something bad against humanity, you can be charged for that, even though you're at war. So we have a bunch of war crime trials. They happen over in Nuremberg, Germany, and the Nazis were tried for the atrocities that they committed during that war. And of course, those members who were running those extermination camps were put on trial, and a lot of them were found guilty, and some even put to death, right? Trials did happen in Japan following, and about 4,000 Japanese war criminals were convicted of doing things that were inhuman during war. Now, what's interesting to note about that is this never happened before in world history, and now if you do something wrong, even though war is happening, you still are liable. You still are going to be found guilty for your actions. So even though war is happening, you need to remain human in that. So I hope that helped you with what was happening. There's a little Japanese person being asked questions, and he'll be found guilty for doing what they did. So no kind of D-Day and it's going to recap what America did during the war in terms of fighting that war. And more importantly for us is in terms of your final exam, we'll deal with what happened on the home front during the war in the next video. So good luck and keep studying. We'll see you soon. Bye.